Paul Chalmers. I am the chair of the Eden Park branch of the Labor Party in Mount Albert. And to celebrate the fact that we had a huge downpour in our rohi not many months ago, we've decided to change our name to the Eden Lake branch. I'd like to introduce Roll. Firstly, thank you, Jill. Jill, thank you for the I'd like to introduce Robert. For those of you that don't know Robert, here he is. Robert, where are you? You're over there. Robert has a background as a CEO, management consultant, and university teacher. He has an MA in philosophy and a PhD in health planning. Very good. He was the chair of the Council for Socially Responsible Investment 2003 to 2012, and he founded the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. He led a 12-year Quaker program with Gajah. What's that? Is it the Gajah University in Indonesia, in introducing conflict resolution training into the Indonesian police? Seriously? Really? Well done. His current focus is ecological degradation, financial systems, and ethics. I'd like to introduce Robert.
So, I want to talk about the examples to be learned, validation. What is validation? The 4 steps that you need to go through in order to be able to decide how to invest ethically. And I also want to, right at the end, talk about some implications for government activities. My focus was really on providing you with some information to be able to invest. But I also realised just the last week that in actual fact, what is the lessons to be learned in the financial sector apply to all government activity. If you take the New Zealand Superannuation Fund and the the inclusions, and the Norwegian Council of Ethics exclusions, that is what the Norwegians didn't invest in, but the super fund did. The differences are Walmart, Heavy Electricals, Duke Energy, IJM Corp, ZT Corp, and Phosphates from Sahara. So these are clear examples that are unacceptable to us, and yet our and unacceptable to the Norwegians, but our super fund has invested those in 2018. In 2020, they were actually invested in nuclear weapons production, coal and coal-based energy, severe environmental damage, serious violations of individual rights in situations of war, and in human rights. Track, which is an NGO in Europe, produced an analysis between 2016 and 2020 to show the world's 60th biggest banks have invested 3.8 trillion in fossil fuels during that period. And the big problem, the number one culprit was JP Morgan Chase, but the others were just as bad. The New Zealand Super Fund, if you go through that list of 60, have invested during just recently during the analysis, they have had investments in Citibank, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Barclays, HSBC, Bank of China, and the Agricultural Bank of China. So the numbers there are what those banks had invested in fossil fuels, and the New Zealand Super Fund was invested in those. They last year announced that they were going to shift 25 billion or 40% to a low carbon indices, 25 billion into passive investments in global equities. The MSCI World Climate Paris Aligned Index was designed to reduce exposure to transition and physical climate risks, pursue opportunities arising from the transition to a low carbon economy, aligning themselves with the Paris Agreement, and incorporated the climate-related financial institutions. The majority of funds list the top 10 investments. Within those top 10, was JP Morgan Chase. Here's an example of simplicity. They say they invest with conscience. We don't make money from companies that cause harm. So the moral ethic is the notion of causing harm. It's good for returns too. KiwiSaver, Generate, they talk about being ethical, and yet the three banks out of the 60, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, Generate were invested in those banks. They're also invested in Bank Central Australia, which has got a terrible reputation for deforestation in Indonesia.
Central Asia or Central Australia?
Constantly changing. Wise Response made some complaints in 2021 about Pathfinder, Generate, APM Wealth, APM Capital. The Financial Markets Authority said we cannot regulate these companies from an ethical point of view because values are subjective and constantly changing. Well, they can't define greenwashing. The Old Testament talks about murder, stealing, and false witness. This is not a value that's been constantly changing. War crimes, slavery, and human rights solution. Validation. Validation is the process that you go through in order to ensure that, these examples indicate there's widespread misunderstanding about what ethical investment means and how it should be measured. The method of establishing what is ethical is the process of validation. Does the measure actually measure what it claims to measure? You make two steps. Content validation requires the consideration of a conceptual level that makes sense. Is it consistent and comprehensive? So if a fund, say, claims to be ethical and deals only with human relations but ignores the environment, then it's not comprehensive. Constructability requires empirical considerations. Is the application of the measure consistent with other empirical evidence? Content. To establish content validation involves examining the links between ordinary language schema and the key concepts proposed. The key concept, do no harm, be responsible, be sustainable. Take the responsibility of guardianship, act with integrity. Schema are codes or laws, charters, creeds, or policies. For example, every major company in New Zealand has a human relationship policy. These are putting together the responsibilities that the employer has for employees and the employees have for the employers. You're going to disagree about details, but that's what a human relationship policy is. It's a code. And then you've got ordinary language. We talk about right, wrong, good, bad, obligation, duty, responsibility. For example, parental responsibility towards children at the basic level in ordinary language. Values are judgments of worth, and they can be personal, and they can also be for the public good and safety. Codes are rules describing values, standards, cultural customs, policies that define acceptable behaviour. When you look at the moral domain, the public good and safety values are enshrined in fundamental humanitarian principles, the United Nations Charter, for example, the laws, Human Rights Act, the Animal Welfare Act, the Wildlife Act, conventions and agreements. We have signed up to the International Convention on Biodiversity. We have policies for trees. We look after certain kauri, for example, endangered species, the Maori dolphin, and the protection of wilderness through national parks and so on. We use concepts like Code of Conduct for Forest Stewardship Council certification. And then there are the Maori values of equality and fairness and guardianship, stewardship, and care. The Ombudsman made this statement about a year ago which is actually really important. He said, regulatory policy design during COVID-19 pandemic states that Crown treaty obligations, human rights, and international law obligations form an important part of an ombudsman investigation and review of agencies' practices and decisions. This means that policy design and implementation should reflect the democratic and constitutional principles of Aotearoa New Zealand, including the Treaty of Waitangi. So he's laying down criteria for the evaluation of government investment, among other things. He did it in the context of evaluating the government's policy with regard to COVID. Here's an example of animal welfare and how it cascades down through the various levels. Pete Singer is an Australian philosopher. He's most famous for his book on animal evaluation. He's been a long-standing critic and advocate for animal liberation. And he wrote that book, which gave the philosophical considerations to argue that animals have a sentient nature. That means they are able to feel emotions to some extent, think and reason, and that we have a responsibility to look after them. New Zealand legislation in the Animal Welfare Act says that animals, we cannot cause animals to suffer or be in pain or distress. That act defines national animal welfare ethics committees, and they establish codes of conduct. They establish the minimum standards in a way in which persons can care for animals and include recommendations of best practice. For example, 2012, the national government at the time, reviewed chickens and decided that they needed to protect chickens in terms of caged chickens. And that's why we have a problem with eggs at the moment, because a number of chicken farmers didn't get their act together on time. But it's that cascading down and linking up, which provides you with the means of ensuring that the appropriate principles, the legislation, or the charters, or so on, translate into specific ethics bodies responsible for that, code of conduct and behaviour at the bottom. There are two confusing terms for ethical investment: sustainability, ESG, which means taking into account environmental, social, and governance factors. They talk about socially responsible, environmentally responsible, and responsible. The New Zealand Super Fund had legislation passed that it was to avoid prejudice to New Zealand's reputation as a responsible member of the world community. We had a conference in 2006 that showed that the Super Fund was invested in tobacco, and they eventually decided that they had to get out of tobacco. They recognised that the legislation did not force them to do it, but they did it because of public opinion. They excluded Freeport Moran on grounds of public embarrassment. So the New Zealand Super Fund interpreted prejudice as equating responsible. And they said, to be responsible, we'll adopt ESG practices. But ESG are not moral terms. They just say you need to consider the environment, social and governance factors. But it's what is good and bad about those. That they don't define that. And more recently, they talked about sustainability. So the United Nations Principles of Responsible never defines what's responsible. The reporting exchange in 2019 identified 1,700 different ESG standards, 360 different ESG accounting standards. The Economist says ideally you should scrap ESG. There are major problems with greenwashing. What is sustainable? Sustainability, the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level. It's enduring. We talk about sustainable fish stocks, we talk about sustainable forests, but we don't talk about sustainable murder. We don't talk about sustainable animal cruelty, sustainable slavery. These are wrong, not because of their whether they are or not sustainable. It's because of the commitment to observe life, human life, take responsibility for animals. And the proliferation of overlapping standards of sustainability has led to the establishment of the International Sustainable Standard Board in 2021. That means they don't know how to define it. So two different forms of sustainability, the weak sustainability and strong sustainability. The top left diagram talks about environment, social and economic. That usually means that you adopt the Mickey Mouse model of the triple bottom line, where the priority is given to financial or economic return, taking priority. But if you look at the diagram at the bottom, we are part of an ecosphere, which is part of a social sphere, which is part of the biosphere. We are not separate in the way that the weak sustainability model is defined, and that's one of the major problems in people talking about sustainability. I did an analysis of simplicity, and I developed a framework called looking at human-human relationships, human-earth relationships overall, human-animal relationships, and human-other, land, soil, plants and forests, rivers, lakes, oceans, and atmosphere. And at the end of these slides, which will be available, I've got those listed in detail. They are a list of questions under those headings, of the questions that you need to ask, or we need to ask, in order to be identify whether a fund actually carries out its ethical responsibilities in those characteristics. There are other options for key principles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights deals with human relations. World Charter for Nature talks about respect for nature. The Earth Charter talks about 16 principles identified under 4 major categories of respect and care for the community of life, ecological integrity, social and economic justice, democracy, non-violence and peace. Other options include care for people and the planet, integrity, oneness, intrinsic value, resilience, stewardship or guardianship, do no harm, wholeness. I'm simply saying that there is not one principle that is right. Some of those I would argue against, but I would prefer caring for people on the planet as my personal preference, but there are choices there. You need to note that some frameworks for country priority have problems. The well-being concept, for example, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment showed that the way in which environment is not defined very clearly means that the whole concept of well-being cannot be implemented at the moment. And if you look at the social development goals, it talks about the first development goal is poverty reduction. Well, it's not the responsibility of a fund per se to do poverty reduction. That's a government responsibility. So you can't hold a company accountable for not reducing poverty. It may do it accidentally or whatever, but that's not its primary role. The Financial Market Authority, confusion reigns. On one hand, they say they will not act on wise response complaints because values are subjective and confusing. Yet, they have issued a code of conduct for financial advice services based on integrity, fairness, protecting client information. So on one hand, they're saying you can't define values. On the other hand, they've got a code. So it's in contradiction of its own codes and also the advice of the State Service Commission. State Service Commission Code of Integrity and Conduct for Government Departments, Crown entities, has come into the public discussion of the last few weeks or so, talks about the notion of integrity, the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, trustworthiness, responsibility. I mean, the State Service Commission has been able to define values, whether you agree with them or not. They've defined values that the financial markets authorities say you can't define. So if you are looking for a framework for the 4 steps that one should brief your Kiwi Saver fund or your your financial advisor, this is it. You have to decide what are your values that you are going to hold a fund to. And it needs to be comprehensive and validated. Talks about the values, the moral domain and the family and the moral values. The second step is you have to decide what you're going to exclude. Now you've got to exclude nuclear weapons, anti-personal mines, tobacco, fossil fuel companies, human rights. I mean, there are some funds that exclude very little because they want to do the third step, which is engage. But there are other funds that exclude a hell of a lot. So there are no one answers here, it's tactical. You need to recognise the investment organisations in a fund is going to engage. The ICCR, the Interfaith Centre for Corporate Responsibility in America, is the best social shareholder advocacy, and they've got, I won't have time now, but they've got examples of how they engage. But you need to recognise that if you are going to sell off shares in, for example, fossil fuels, then who are you going to sell it to? What's happened over the last few years is because of the international acronym that has gone on to the major oil people. They have started to sell it off, and they've sold it off to companies like Inuit, who fund the oil patch. And they are a small player in the overall scheme of things within the fossil fuel scheme, and they're continuing business as usual. And so there's something like 143 billion that have been sold, shares that have been sold to the minor players, and they're just continuing to keep operating. In a number of cases, it's been privatised. So just by selling shares to feel good doesn't necessarily mean that you actually are bringing about changes. There aren't any easy answers about that. You have to decide. And lastly, how is it going to report? If a fund says, I'm going to adopt the principle of do no harm, then does it do no harm? It should have an annual report looking at its investments and saying, this doesn't do any harm. This does, but we're engaging with them. And if we're engaging with them, what are the results? So if there's one slide that I want you to take away, that's the one slide. Simplicity. Simplicity invests in conjunction with Vanguard. And then Vanguard invests in 1,600 companies. It votes on 1,760 matters, and it engages with 650 companies. And it engages on board composition, oversight, strategy, risk, executive compensation, and shareholder rights. They are invested in JP Morgan Chase, and they did engage with JP Morgan Chase, but only about board composition and executive compensation. They didn't actually engage with them about the fact that they were screwing up the planet. That was not the case. So the notion of do no harm actually is a valid concept, a valid principle on the grounds of content and constraint. It's just that simplicity didn't follow it properly. So New Zealand has a well-established use of ethical to include human earth responsibilities in its moral domain, humanitarian principles, laws, codes of conduct. The current behaviour of most Kiwi saver funds and the New Zealand Superannuation Fund is unethical. It is inconsistent with government missions, such as the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, what would I recommend you, how you act? The title of this seminar is State of the Environment, What We Can Do. Well, this is one thing you can do. You can look at the way you invest your money. As an individual, ask your financial planner or advisor to follow the 4 steps below. That's not going to be easy because they're going to come back and say your standards and requirements are too high. You're going to have to actually start choosing some priorities. Ensure that they are validated ethical principles, key concepts to use. Identify what type of investment are to be excluded or favoured. Ask about the engagements and how does the fund report. So I want to reflect now on some wider issues. The Ombudsman criteria for ethical behaviour of government regarding COVID applies to all government departments and agencies and their behaviour generally. If ethical rules are not followed, public trust in government diminishes. During the first COVID, Jacinda talked about kindness. The Labor Party's ratings were way up here. During the second COVID, we had pictures of people, pregnant ladies, parents dying, etc., who just could not get through the MIQ system. Labor lost the votes. If you looked at the voting pattern during that time, which was a strong reaction, it went down. So, if you don't invest ethically, one of the consequences is that the public don't trust you. So, ethical investment and ethics is not just some fancy academic stuff. It actually has implications at the polls. So I would recommend the State Service Commission should be updated to include human obligations and apply to all government departments and agencies with an annual report on conformity to that code and a requirement for papers to the Cabinet to be evaluated by that code. So no papers should go to Cabinet unless they have a checklist off to see whether they meet the obligations as defined by the Ombudsman, includes human rights and an obligation to care for the earth. The rationale, I'm just picking up again some themes that were talked about this morning. The rationale for the New Zealand Superannuation Fund being established is based on the assumption that there will be a fund to assist tax-paying pensions and retirement in 2035-36. So it was set up to help the pay-as-you-go taxation process as the population aged. The problem is that the UN Environmental Programme talks about no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. And the United Nations Secretary General said to have a chance of avoiding global warming's most ruinous impacts, the world must cut greenhouse gas pollution nearly in half by 2030 and raise its carbon footprint evenly by this century. So what I'm saying is that the New Zealand Super Fund was built on the assumption of a business as usual program, that in fact you could get enough return to be able to pay for the pension. And I seriously doubt whether in fact in 2035 and 40, the funds will have the investment that it has at the moment, because it would depreciate in value because of the ecological degradation that was talked about this morning. And in addition, Accenture, a consultancy, said around 1/3 of the world's 2,000 biggest firms by revenue have publicly stated net zero goals. 93% have no chance of achieving their targets without doing much more than they are at the moment. Few businesses lay out a credible investment plan or specify milestones whereby progress can be judged.
So the short answer is, if you are going to rely on the private industry to be able to fund your superannuation schemes and pension schemes and pay your taxes, and at the same time deal with climate change, then I have big question marks about that. We face a future with increasing severity, numbers of extreme weather events, significant social and economic impacts through an energy damaging structure, quality water, food production, supply chains, and Ukraine war plus COVID is the type of disruption we can expect on a regular basis. And these factors raise questions about the prudence of much medium to longer term investment. Those are the questions that you can see available on the web.
Very good. Thank you very much, Robert.